Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guest on this next interview. On Tuesday, NASA has announced a major strategic shift in its Artemis program, moving away from lunar orbit infrastructure and towards building a permanent base on the moon's surface. The decision raises not only technological questions, but also geopolitical ones, including the future role of Europe. At the same time, the European Commission will adopt a decision that would privilege European satellite operators in a move designed to curb the European expansion of Starlink, the flagship service of Elon Musk's SpaceX. Joining us today on TVP World to discuss the future of U.S.-European relations in space is Hermann Ludwig Moeller, Director of the European Space Policy Institute. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you. Good morning.
So looking at the latest news, NASA has just presented new plans for sustained human presence on the moon, shifting focus from more like symbolic missions. But why is the moon once again becoming such a strategic priority?
Well, first, what we see is something that was on the horizon since a while. The shift from what was a gateway, so an orbiting station around the moon, to something that focuses now on the surface. The motivation is multiple, and maybe the biggest one is a geopolitical one. Today, we see a race between the US and China to be on the moon and to establish some permanent presence or semi-permanent presence. And this is certainly a sign of acceleration on the US side.
All right, now there's also a recent report that suggests NASA is placing greater emphasis on the surface infrastructure while reducing the importance of the Gateway lunar station, where Europe has already had significant involvement. Could changing priorities in Washington weaken Europe's role when it comes to future lunar expansion?
Well, you made the link in the introduction to Starlink and connectivity services on the ground. So the moon is not just the moon. I think space today is really happening in a triangle between what is exploration and moon and low Earth orbit space stations on one side, which is a digital economy increasingly when it's about connectivity and Starlink, as you mentioned, but predominantly right now also security and defense. So any answer to that question really has to look at that triangle between exploration, security and defense and digital. And I think this is a clear move on the US side, where on the one side, the public is engaging more and more into space. We're looking into 5 to 15 times the investment we see in Europe, and at the same time leveraging commercial forces. And there is going to be an IPO by SpaceX coming up, and I think we'll see enormous dynamic happening.
Do you think that, well, the U.S. and European relation going from a more cooperative one to like a semi or somewhat competitive one is actually going to hinder progress when it actually comes to the goal of space exploration or establishing any sort of presence?
There certainly is a move which is not specific to space, to something that is more transactional. Right. We see this at the Gateway, where, as you mentioned, there has been investments on the European side. There will be an assessment on the European side December this year, how to maybe redirect some of those investments, where Europe went into commitments that today uncertain how they will pay out at the end. It will be a more competitive environment. At the same time, this is not only a question on government-to-government relations or relations between agencies. We'll see increasingly, as I said, also commercial actors defining those relationships.
Right. So, well, again, we've seen, like, for decades, space cooperation being one of the strongest pillar of transatlantic relationship. But Europe is also talking about strategic autonomy as well, where NASA's quietly sidelining European project as well. Do you think space is another area where Europe have to eventually see greater independence from the United States?
Absolutely, yes. I think different to maybe AI or semiconductors or, say, the age of the internet, the time window is still there. We can still develop autonomous solutions. Sovereignty is certainly key. Sovereignty is key to use also space for national security, for Europe's security, as we've seen in the war in Ukraine. It is also relevant, and I would really emphasize this, when it comes to our digital sovereignty, that we still own the information, we store and circulate our information, and it is not outsourced into other forces and commercial competitors.
Right. Speaking of digital sovereignty and outsourcing the competitor, as well as the war in Ukraine, one of the big steps that Europe is taking is the European Commission reportedly considering reserving most future satellite spectrum capability for European operators. Of course, it's limiting access for companies like Starlink or Amazon's capability to operate here in Europe. Do you think that this is more simply an industrial policy, or is it because of the war in Ukraine making European countries realize, okay, perhaps over-reliance on a single large entity is a little bit too risky?
Well, it is certainly much more than industrial policy. I think also in Europe we have realized that as much as on the one hand you need your European industry, and I also emphasize this here, but at the end this serves a purpose. This is to protect us, this is to give us a digital means and competitive economy, and space is going to be part of that economy, like the internet 30 years ago.
Right, but do you think it will take time and resources? I mean, of course, it will take time and resources, but what does a roadmap look like when it comes to becoming digitally sovereign?
That is a big challenge today on Europe. We see this now also when certain software deployments may be migrating to European solutions where we still have a strong dependency. We're talking certainly about a roadmap of a decade. We're talking about something where the scale of investment, where if I talk space, we are a factor of 5 to a factor of 15 below what you see in Europe today. Europe has been stepping up enormously in the past year. European Space Agency, very successful funding round at the ministerial, 22.3 billion for the next 3 years. In Germany, 7 billion for the next 5 years on security. We see countries like Poland, like Spain, Italy, UK, France as a traditional leader stepping up. I think this momentum is happening. We will need to reach 0.15% of GDP and develop into 50 billion investment on the public side per year, midterm. And we will have to aim at 10 to 20% of private capital in this system.
All right, speaking of private capital, now we do know that a large sum of the U.S. space exploration actually do depend on private companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, rather than a government alone. Is that the same case here in Europe? How do you compare the private sector and their involvement in space programs across the Atlantic?
Well, the balance between private and public, also in the U.S., and if you look at what NASA just said regarding the development of commercial space stations, where all of a sudden there is talk about a core module that would be owned by NASA. This is a shift. And that indicates that there is also caution how much market pickup can really absorb what government traditionally has been leading. 85% of investments worldwide are public in space. This shift will not happen from one day to the next, also not in the US. It is true that Europe has more to catch up. And also in this sector, scale-up funding will be an important element. Linking scale-up funding from the capital markets to flagship programs, public-private partnership initiatives, will be a key element.
Right. Can you help us understand the difference between private funding and public sector funding, and what are some of the pros and cons? Is it a good thing that there are a substantial amount of private investment into space?
Well, first, the public side has always been key. If you take meteorological services, this is a public program. A lot of the climate data and the systems that provide this is predominantly public money. There is a clear public role in ensuring this. At the same time, it has become evident that the agility in the system, if you take Elon Musk as a prime example, it depends a lot on private capital. There's more risk-taking associated with this capital. Also, decision-making processes are much quicker. So it's not only the source of the money, it's also the way the money is really injected into the space ecosystem.
All right, now, when it comes to the space race, we talked about it in the beginning, who would you say is pulling ahead right now between the competition in China and the United States?
Yeah, interesting that you mentioned China here. One of the key dates of the next 2-3 years will be who is back to the moon or will be at the moon next. And the Chinese plan today talks about 2030. China has a reputation to be more careful on these dates. So 2029 may not be an unlikely date for China. Now, the question is whether the new schedule on Artemis and what we've seen in the announcement today, whether this can anticipate the US planning, which today would still be slightly ahead, but I think it will depend on how those high-tech systems, developments that come with risks, how they pan out on either side. It will be a very close race.
Right. Going back to the lunar mission, to the Artemis program, we do know that Europe has been a major contributor to the program, providing technology, funding, expertise. But now with the strategic shift, how secure is Europe's place in these long-term lunar ambitions?
If we want to secure as Europe our place in that history making, we certainly need to take the step to autonomous capability. We will need to step up into own capability in human space flight. We can still do this in partnership with other regions, Japan as an example. But I think we need to change the structure of the programs, and we will see the beginning of this year in December. I believe Europe will reorient some of its funding to more own capabilities. Timelines will be a challenge. It's a major undertaking, but I think the direction of the development is becoming clearer and clearer to more autonomous solutions.
All right, so we'll have to see what the future holds for us in space and beyond. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Take care. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.